From studios at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, this is Fourth and State. In this edition, a chat with Mark Dybul, a Whitefish Bay native who has just been named head of a large international fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. I'm David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Welcome to Fourth and State. I'm joined today by Mark Dybul, who's the executive director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, a post he just took late last year. Mark is from the Milwaukee area. He went to Marquette University High School, then on to Georgetown and Georgetown Medical School. And Mark, welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be home.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I wonder if you could start by describing, I guess you'd call it an epiphany that you had during your college years. You weren't really so much into science in those days. I think you were a philosophy major, a good thing to be. But you read an article, I think it was in Newsweek, that sort of turned you more toward the sciences. What happened? What was that all about?
Well, science still is not my favorite thing in the world. It's an enjoyable thing to work on, and I loved having been a scientist for a while. But it wasn't the science itself. It was something captivating about HIV in Africa and what was happening in the continent. And it's difficult to describe it. The only way I've ever been able to describe it's like falling in love. You don't know what it is, why it is. It's just something that grabs a hold of you and you know is going to irrevocably change your life. And I fought against it, as many of us do when we fall in love, for a couple of years. Figured it made no sense. I wanted to do philosophy or theology. But it just kept coming back and coming back. And then I realized that I had to engage in global HIV and changed my life and my career, and went to medical school and science because at the time everyone was dying. And it wasn't that I thought I was a great scientist, I knew I wasn't, but all we could do is watch people die, and that wasn't enough. So I wanted to engage in seeing if I could contribute in some way to advancing our knowledge so that we could do something for people.
And you did a fourth year of medical school in San Francisco. You got to work with the well-known doctor there, Dr. Marcus Conant, who was one of those who identified AIDS early on. But you've described that as being a rather helpless feeling sometimes.
Yeah.
What was that like? What was going on there?
Well, it's really difficult to describe for people who didn't see it, but it was a pall over the city. Life revolved around death. 3 people were dying a day, not a big city. Everyone knew everyone. It was an interconnectedness. Lives really were about funerals. And at the time, it's hard to remember some of this too, the stigma around HIV was horrific. So, you would be with teenagers dying alone because their friends and family had abandoned them because of HIV/AIDS. And it was a remarkable experience to witness that. But in the midst of all that, there was a remarkable bright spot, which was communities coming together to care for each other and carry each other. And so in the midst of the darkest possible moment, the community came together to love and care for each other. And that negative and positive is really remarkable. And since then, I've seen that over and over again in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And what we saw in San Francisco was a fraction of what you see in Africa, where literally an entire generation was wiped out. I've seen villages completely run by orphans because all the adults are gone. As in California and San Francisco, life revolved around funerals. Literally on the weekends, the streets were just packed with coffins because people's bodies were being taken to their villages where they grew up, and all these bodies were clogging the roads. It's beyond description. But still, in that same environment, you had people coming together to say, we can't do anything, but we can care for each other, and it was really a breathtaking experience to see.
That must have been. Now, the Global Fund is an international financing institution that works worldwide. I believe the Gates Foundation is among your funders. Am I right about that? I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what are the challenges now? Is it funding? We live in a world where austerity, especially in Europe, is the word of the day. What are the challenges as you see it toward controlling or maybe one day eradicating
Yeah.
the disease?
Yeah, it's a great question. Really, as in often the challenge begins with understanding and comprehension, and we are at such a unique moment in history. We could not have said what we can say today 2 years ago. The science has advanced, and at the same time, there's been a massive investment in scale up of programming, largely funded by the American taxpayer. The U.S. taxpayer is actually supported through the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and contributions to the Global Fund, a scale up of antiretroviral therapy and prevention programs across the world, but mostly in Africa. That was incomprehensible. And in fact, 10 years ago, people said it couldn't be done. So the science has given us new tools at the same time for prevention and treatment, at the same time that we've learned how to do things better. With the Africans in the lead, with the people in Latin America and Asia in the lead, they are taking control, as we saw in San Francisco. The communities are taking control of fighting their infections, and the science, we have advances in the last 2 years that tell us how we can defeat HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. Completely control them. Not yet eliminate, but completely control them. That's a moment in history we have never had.
That's really shocking from somebody like me who has followed this from the very beginning.
And it's shocking to a lot of people. And we're
marvelous.
at a moment, at this moment. And you don't get these moments in history very often.
Right.
It's true for tuberculosis and malaria. We actually have the same thing, scientific advance, implementation advance. So we're at this historic moment where if we invest today, literally in the next short period of time, in our lifetimes, in our policy-making lifetimes, we can see a complete control of these infections. And we don't get those opportunities very much in a lifetime. You know, two HIV, or TB and malaria plagues that have been around for millennia, HIV, the modern day Black Plague, and we actually have the tools to completely control them. So do we want to tell our grandchildren we had this tremendous moment and they don't have these diseases because we stood up and seized the moment, or do we want to tell them we had a financial crisis so we let it go away? And that's the flip side. There are some who might say, and fairly reasonably, let's wait 5 years. You know, let's wait till the economies are stronger, and then we'll get back to it. The thing we know is we're on a downward trajectory in all three of these diseases. We know, and we have the data, that if you don't keep your foot on the pedal, they're going to start coming back up. And while we've had enough scientific and implementation advance to give us the ability on these downward slopes to get to complete control, if they go back up, we don't have the technology. They're not good. The technology is not good enough, and we don't have the know-how to do it on the ground. So we'll lose this moment. Literally, in the next 5 years, we will lose this moment. And the really impressive thing is if we can completely control, then you don't need a very effective vaccine to end it. You only need a partially effective vaccine, and those are on the horizon. So this massive investment we've made in the 10 years have brought us to a point in science and implementation where we can completely control and possibly potentially end, or we can let it slip away. And when we let it slip away, tens and tens of millions of more people will die, and will cost billions and billions more, tens of billions more, to try to control it because
I was going to get to that.
Isn't
there, and not that this is, I think there's a incredibly strong moral argument for doing everything that your group and others like the Gates Foundation does. But isn't there also an economic argument?
Absolutely. Economic and it's enlightened self-interest.
Right.
We have an opportunity in history that is a moral requirement to act on and for the generations to come, but we also have an economic issue of if we don't invest, and in a sense we won't lose because we've saved millions of lives, but we don't capitalize on the investment of the last 10 years. We lose the return on investment by not basically doubling down and seeing it through to the end.
So you said this in a essay you wrote for the Huffington Post recently, that we have a historic opportunity to get these infectious diseases under control, which will change the fortunes of millions of lives and improve the development of many entire countries. And now I'm going to ask you to put on your editor's hat and edit this down a little bit for me in a minute or two. What are the 5 or 6 ways, sort of broad things that we have to do?
The first thing we need to do is invest smarter, and that's what we've learned.
Give me an example of what's smart investing.
A great example is we've been almost controlled by the tyranny of averages. So we look at average infection rates in a country or new infection rates. What the science is now telling us is that doesn't make any sense, that there are pockets of really high transmission. Milwaukee has a great example. You have one population African American men where we see a really high transmission.
Right.
Same in Washington, D.C.
Right.
It's not the whole city, it's a part of the city. And if we focus all of our attention on these high transmission areas, great example is in South Africa. Girls 15 to 19-year-olds have a transmission rate that's probably 10 times higher than the general population. So you want to invest in the same interventions for the whole population, which we can't afford to do and won't have very much impact, or do you want to focus in a concentrated way where the new infections are? And that's what we're all about, focusing on.
So follow the data.
Follow the data.
Yeah.
Follow the data,
Yeah.
and use your interventions to in a concentrated way where those high transmission rates are and where the high risk populations are. And that's a really exciting moment too. Not only can we end epidemics, but we can actually change the human spirit and how we view the human family. Because who are the people most at risk of HIV today? Whether it's African American males in inner cities in this country, or young girls, young women in Africa, or sex workers who are doing that work largely because they've been marginalized economically, often girls that were cast aside, orphans and vulnerable children who have a much higher risk of infection, prisoners, very high risk of tuberculosis, especially in Eastern Europe, people who use drugs, often out of addiction, men who have sex with men in places where that's not acceptable to the general population, so marginalized people who are not considered to be part of the human family, which reminds me of my days in San Francisco, actually. And that all changed here. You know, we changed. So we have a chance not only to defeat disease, but to change our humanness and welcome everyone into the human family and use actually the control of 3 plagues to change the human spirit. That's pretty cool.
That's very cool. And I would just add here that James E. Causey, one of our columnists, wrote in our Sunday paper last Sunday about the uptick in cases in Milwaukee, and one of the things he found was part of it is cultural in the African American community, the idea of AIDS still being somewhat stigmatized. And so part of what we've thought, and he's made it a crusade of his own, is you've just got to keep communicating.
Exactly. And that's the, you know, we talk about health often as clinics, physicians, and all that's important. But the non-health aspects of health are incredibly important, the cultural aspects. How are you going to bring those people into the human family? It's not going to be by a physician or a clinic. It's going to be by the community and everyone coming to see the world and its members in a different way. And that's what happened in this country with the gay population and not separate but part of us. And how do we welcome them in and care and service them and prevent infection, and then that's good for us too because we tamp down these infections. So it's a remarkable opening around community and culture in the civil society. You know, I don't know if you've read Bill Foege's book about ending smallpox. The vaccine was important, but he talks more about the cultural aspects of getting people to not hide people who had smallpox because of the stigmatization, but actually identify who they were to care for them. And then by identifying the communities where the smallpox was and focusing vaccines there as opposed to the general population, we were able to control smallpox in a very small period of time. But the cultural aspects were as important as the health advance aspects. And that's the great thing about the last 10 years. The science has advanced, but so is our understanding about how to work with communities and do a much better job. And that's why we're at this pivotal moment in history that we can seize or we can let go.
I was struck too by the piece you wrote in Huffington Post. I think you mentioned mosquito nets.
Yeah.
Very simple, a couple dollars maybe, for malaria that could make a huge difference, is making a huge difference in parts of the world. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be an expensive drug sometimes.
No, some of the greatest scientific advances are not. So long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets. So the nice thing about the new bed nets is it doesn't just keep the mosquitoes from getting at you by having a net. There's an insecticide in it, so as soon as the mosquito touches the net, it dies. So you're not only preventing yourself from getting bitten, you're actually preventing other people from being bitten because the mosquitoes are dying. And these nets have had a huge impact. We've seen decreases of 50% of childhood mortality in some countries from malaria. 20% overall death rates among kids because malaria is such a leading killer of kids. And then there are other things with spraying, you know, things that we didn't have to do in this country anymore, and then also new drugs to treat people who have malaria, none of which is very expensive at all. It's just, and that's where the community piece goes in. When we first gave bed nets out, we just gave people bed nets and then figured they'd hang them. Come back 2 months later and you find out they're in a nice package under their beds because they didn't want to unwrap this beautiful net that was in a plastic container.
Sure.
People were using them to fish with.
Oh.
So you needed the community engagement to say, hang the net, this is why, show them how to do it. So it really brings in those non-health components of health as well. But to buy and hang a bed net costs $6 and it covers 2 kids. And so we almost have universal coverage now, which means we can see malaria getting to such low rates. And then we also have a malaria vaccine in process, partially effective. So if we control enough, that partially effective vaccine will be enough.
It's like you were saying before, it doesn't have to be fully effective if you've done everything else.
If you've done everything else.
All right, well, finally, let me just ask you one other thing. What would you like to leave our viewers with? So what's sort of the one thing you want them to know?
Know that HIV, TB, and malaria can end. Know that we have the science and ability to do it, and get engaged. You can get engaged by telling your politicians, this is important. Yes, we're in a tough budgetary cycle, but we have a moment no one in history has ever had before, and we care, and we're going to seize this moment. You can get engaged by contributing personally, your time or effort. You can get involved in the HIV epidemic here. You can link with people in Africa if you want. But get engaged, know about it, get excited about it. Get excited about this moment in history that no generation has ever had before, and no generation will ever have again, and make sure we seize this moment.
Seize the moment. Well, Mark Dybul, welcome back to Milwaukee and good luck in your new appointment.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for being with us on 4th and State.